welcome Professor Douglas Baird right here in front of the lectern, who is the Garstang Chair of Archaeology at the University of Liverpool and currently also Associate Dean for Research in the School of Histories, Languages and Cultures. And the name Garstang means a lot to me as a Hittitologist. He was one of the very first generation of Hittitologists, so that makes it all the more an honor to have you here among us this evening. Professor Baird has done a lot of research in the Middle East since 1979. He has surveyed and excavated in Cyprus, Iraq, Jordan, and especially Turkey. He has been excavating in the Konya plain, which I'm sure he will show you, 2 sites which between them span the Epi-Paleolithic and the late Neolithic Pınarbașı and Boncuklu. He recently resumed excavations on the Epi-Paleolithic cemetery at Pınarbașı, the site that I just mentioned, and over the past 8 years he has also worked in Iraq, re-excavating some of Robert and Linda Braidwood's sites there. And he is due to start excavating at the site in northern Iraq, where the Braidwoods most regretted not having been able to excavate. Professor Baird is the co-author of 3 books with 2 more on the way. His CV shows also an enormous amount of articles in journals and edited volumes, which I didn't even dare to start counting. And finally, what always impresses me very much from his CV, the great number of students that he has advised and is still advising on their way to PhD degrees. Tonight he will give a lecture to us, the Braidwood lecture, under this intriguing title, Skulls and Animate Houses, Life Histories and House Histories at Neolithic Boncuklu. In this lecture, he will allow us a vision of contemporaneous adoption of variable sedentary practices, small-scale cultivation and herding, and in some cases, and I'm very eager to hear more about that, in some cases, avoidance of farming by early Neolithic communities. He will talk about the role of development of distinct community identities within such proximate communities, and talk about intimate and specific household and individual histories and identities, ritual and ancestral practices within longer-term developments. So I think we are in for a wonderful lecture, and please join me in welcoming Professor Douglas Baird.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Obviously, it's an honor for me to be giving one of the Braidwood lectures, and I am going to divert slightly from my main topic in the next slide, just to pay a little homage to the Braidwoods and their work in Iraq. Before I really get into the lecture, though, I just want to remind people, of course, that this is a team effort. I'm giving my perceptions on some of the work we've done, but we have many specialists working on the project. I'll try and mention some of them, but I can't mention all of them. And I particularly want to start by pointing out that I have 2 co-directors on the project, Gürkan Mustafalı, who's based in Hacı Bayram Veli University in Ankara, and Andy Fairburn, who's based in the University of Queensland. So this is very much a joint effort, and this is by way of thanking the sponsors of various sorts as well on that first slide. As I said, I just wanted to pay a little homage to the Braidwoods in terms of some of the work that we're renewing in North Iraq. This is a bit like the beginning of that Monty Python film, Life of Brian, where I'm talking about something that isn't part of the lecture, but nevertheless could be quite entertaining. So this is the site of Karaçıvar. It's a lovely 2.5 hectare, very early Neolithic site. goes back to the beginning of the Neolithic, and I think, as Taylor mentioned in the intro, this is a site that Robert Braidwood himself, in some of his more memoir pieces, said the site he most regretted not excavating, having discovered it through survey activity. So its location has been a bit hazy over the past few decades, so actually this January, just a few weeks ago, myself and Elaine Suti from Liverpool tramped over these various areas of Kurdistan and tracked it back down again. So we intend to start excavation there next spring. So Braidwood's work really does continue in North Iraq. And whilst that's a slightly different topic from the one I'm going to talk about today, of course there is a link, because Braidwood is particularly famous for his interest in the origins of sedentism and agriculture, particularly in the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, North Iraq and southeastern Turkey. A lot of work since Braidwood, footnotes to Braidwood if you like, have been very focused on the really big questions of the where, when, how, who and why of the origins of sedentism and agriculture. And I'll certainly address briefly at least some of these big questions with brief answers as it happens in this case. But I particularly want to talk about what it was to be a forager caught up in this process, if you like, how the households and individuals that made up these early sedentary and agricultural communities were affected by and contributed to this process that we call the origins of agriculture. And I think sort of looking now at unpacking the large-scale phenomena to see how they operated at community, household and individual level is a major challenge for us going ahead. And as part of that, I think it's very interesting as well to evaluate how much these developments were homogeneous or diverse phenomena for the people involved in them, and what increasing residential stability particularly meant for the nature of households and individuals through their life course. So as my title suggests, I am going to try and get to individuals and households as well as answering some of the bigger questions in this lecture. The case study area that I'm talking about is the western part of the Konya Plain, the western Konya Basin. It's an inland drainage basin about 1,000 meters above sea level for most of the basin. The river's draining down from the surrounding hills and hilly areas of the plateau, the Taurus to the south here. Of course, situated in south-central Turkey, just north of the Taurus. This, of course, is a bit of a different environment for the Fertile Crescent, so it's very interesting to look at as a case of the early appearance of sedentism and agriculture outside the Fertile Crescent area and whether or not different factors and processes were in play. The site I'm mainly going to talk about is Boncuklu, located here about 9.5 kilometers north of Çatalhöyük, World Heritage Site that's pretty well known to most people. Very big, famous for being big and its elaborate art and symbolism. But it is quite late in the Neolithic, and for a long time we haven't known much about its antecedents, and now I think we can see Boncuklu as an antecedent community. So we understand something about the emergence of these bigger, later Neolithic sites. I'll also talk about the site of Pınarbașı, located about 31 kilometers southeast of Boncuklu and partially contemporary, at least. At the periods that we're talking about, and we'll talk about the precise chronology in a minute, this area that's now a series of massive alluvial fans, you can see in the satellite imagery, these grey soil areas. This is all alluvium brought down by the rivers. But 10, 12,000 years ago, it was a much more mosaic landscape of steppe areas with extensive wetlands in the centre of the basin that the sites of Boncuklu and Pınarbașı are close by. These weren't the only sites in the 10th, 9th and 8th millennium in this area. There are a few other settlements scattered around in the wetland areas in particular. So these certainly weren't isolated communities, perhaps in contrast to especially the earlier Neolithic at Çatalhöyük itself, the early late Neolithic, if you like, when Çatal becomes a very large and somewhat isolated community. What's the chronological range that we're talking about? This chart shows you a series of model C14 dates. Actually, these are not models of individual dates, but themselves sums of sequences of dates relating to particular events on the site, the best way to get a sense of overall site chronology. You can see the calibrated dates BC here, and this represents a Bayesian analysis. You can see that Pınarbașı actually starts slightly with a date a bit earlier than this, actually about 9,500 BC, and runs down to about 7,800 BC. So very long period of occupation at Pınarbașı, and Boncuklu quite long as well. The main phase that we've excavated runs from about 8,300 BC to 7,600 BC. So immediately you can see we have two sites located 30 kilometers apart that, at least for the last centuries of the occupation of Boncuklu, were contemporaneous. I've got some more update to give you on that from very recent evidence. But Pınarbașı starts a bit earlier and stops a bit earlier, so they're not precisely contemporary. So we can explore two communities. Let's just jump straight into the question of some of these big issues of the appearance of cultivation and herding and sedentism. I'll deal with them first before we start to look at household and life histories at Boncuklu in particular. What's the picture we have for the appearance of agriculture in this area? Well, it's very interesting. This represents the presence of some of the first cultivar crops on Neolithic sites in Southwest Asia generally. These are some of the sites that are contemporary and later than Boncuklu and Pınarbașı in central Anatolia. And you can see immediately that, intriguingly, both epipaleolithic, there's an epipaleolithic phase at Pınarbașı as well, but also the early Holocene phase at Pınarbașı completely lack the earliest cultivars that we know from Southwest Asia. They lack not just actual domesticated or cultivated variants of these species, but actually the wild ancestors as well. And given that represents several millennia of activity at the site of Pınarbașı, when people were there in the correct seasons for harvesting these wild cereals and legumes, I think this absence strongly suggests that these plants are not present in the local environment around Pınarbașı. So when we see them at Boncuklu, it's very likely that they've been adopted from elsewhere. That's one of our basic arguments, that the Konya Plain season adoption. This is further strengthened by the fact that we see at Boncuklu early domestic emmer. Emmer as a wild plant is found specifically and particularly in the Levantine areas, so I think its presence on the Konya Plain is a clear indication of the import of these species. In fact, all of these species are domesticates at Boncuklu from 8,300 BC, from the earliest phases of occupation. So we're seeing here the introduction of farming of plants to the Konya Plain, adopted by local forager communities. Interestingly, though, of course, we know Pınarbașı is contemporary, but the Pınarbașı community, over the many centuries in which it's contemporary with Boncuklu, completely eschews the adoption of agriculture. So in an area only 30 kilometers apart, I think we can already see one answer to the question I posed at the beginning. Clearly, the adoption of agriculture, the spread of agriculture, is not a homogeneous process in which all communities are participating. Some choose to adopt agriculture and others reject it quite strongly, it would appear, if we look at this graph. I have to say this evidence comes not just from the carbonized plant remains, but from phytolith silicified plant cells as well. The other thing that we've learned from the studies of these plant remains on the site, whether the carbonized or the phytolith material, is that when cultivation is adopted at Boncuklu, it appears to be adopted on a small scale. It's just added to a wide repertoire of other subsistence practices. If we look at the slightly later sites of Janasan III and Çatalhöyük, you see very clearly how both the frequency and the ubiquity of these plants at these slightly later sites is much higher than at Boncuklu. Because this is represented by the phytoliths as well as the carbonized material, we're happy this isn't a taphonomic or preservational bias or problem. It does seem that cultivation was adopted as a small-scale endeavour as part of the spread of farming outside of the Fertile Crescent. So in many ways, the foragers at Boncuklu continued traditional practices, I think. Why then did they adopt farming while the Pınarbașı community didn't. Well, in terms of the why for Boncuklu, I think there might be some reasons. It obviously didn't represent a massive revolution in economic practice, if you like, but it probably added resilience to the community by broadening the food base. And I think we should also entertain the possibility that it was a more culinary, exciting world that this community developed as a result of adding these plants to the food repertoire. Bread of ages, we might say. So that's the picture we've had until very recently, but you dig a site for 15 years and you think that you might know most of what it's got to reveal, but Boncuklu is a site that keeps on giving, lots of surprises. Over the past couple of years, we've dug levels earlier than those that we've dated to 8,300 BC. I always expected, of course, that probably the site would go back a few centuries earlier than 8,300. My guess was 8,600, but these deposits we've been excavating in our deep sounding, I'll say more about them in a moment. Actually, the earliest levels we've reached so far, not perhaps, or dated so far, not the very earliest deposits, actually now date to 9,250 BC. This is very exciting, of course, because it has the potential to push back the beginnings of farming in the Konya plain much earlier than we'd appreciated hitherto, much earlier than the contemporary site of Ashukla, for example, in Cappadocia, right back into the Levantine pre-pottery Neolithic A, which is when we see actually the very earliest pre-domestication cultivation. So actually maybe as soon as we have pre-domestication cultivation in the Levantine area and southeastern Anatolia, in fact, we may have it in central Anatolia too. It's still early days because, of course, Andy Fairbairn and Emma Jenkins are working on the carbonized plants and the phytoliths, still working through the material and fitting it into that sequence. If I had to give you a guess, this is obviously not for publication purposes, I think somewhere around, we start seeing cereals somewhere around 8,800, 8,600 at Boncuklu. So this is exciting new evidence, I think, that will prompt some re-evaluation of the development of cultivation, not just in central Anatolia, but more broadly across Southwest Asia. The early phases of the site are quite interesting as well. They're not much to look at photogenically or otherwise. Actually, there are a series of thin sediments with phytolith surfaces, lots of little post holes and stake holes. Often these surfaces are set in cuts. You can see a cut running through the deposits here. All these areas are later Neolithic graves that cut into these earlier deposits, why it's a bit unclear exactly what we're looking at here. But the interesting thing is there's no evidence for mud brick architecture. Rather, these earliest phases probably have wooden structures with these matted floors, sometimes covered with red ochre and the like. So early architecture at Boncuklu is a little bit different from what I'm going to show you in a moment or two. And that's interesting as well in terms of the picture of the development of sedentary behavior at the site. So that's agriculture, fairly rapidly dealt with in terms of its emergence in central Anatolia. We have also very early evidence for the management of caprines, sheep and goat, at the site. Sheep and goat are native in the area. They're hunted already in the Epipaleolithic. And this also shows, I think, an interesting picture of small-scale management of these domesticated resources, we might call them. Actually, one of the interesting things about Boncuklu is, despite the caprine predominance at later Çatalhöyük, we only have a very small percentage of sheep and goat at the site, about 5%. So they weren't really important in terms of, meat provision. Small samples make it difficult to use the morphometrics of the animal bones to say whether they were domestic or not, and you might assume not, given how infrequent they are. But Caroline Middleton has done a carbon and nitrogen stable isotope study of the caprines and the boss as well, as a way of looking at potential changing diet through time and human interference with the animals. What she documented was a wild signature from Epipaleolithic and early Holocene Pınarbașı, low in nitrogen with no C4 plants in the animal's diet. The slightly later animals from Çatalhöyük that we know are domesticated have elevated nitrogen and C4. So that's perhaps a signature of the management of caprines. And one of the interesting things is about 50% of the caprines from Boncuklu show actually extremely elevated nitrogen that I think comes from grazing marshland areas near the site, not in the natural habitats of these animals. The people at Boncuklu are bringing these animals from the hills and keeping them close to the site, even if they're not yet domestic, but in relatively small numbers compared to the other animals that they're hunting and consuming. The other evidence we have for this caprine management is the presence of herbivore dung in the fire installations at the site. Again, we've got a very interesting picture here of not a rapid transition to large-scale herding, but rather the addition of a small number of herded animals to the economic portfolio, if you like, of this community. Why might that happen in this situation? Well, it's very unlikely that these animals added very much to the meat repertoire of this community that ate a lot of wild cattle, in particular, and a lot of wild boar. It seems much more likely there must have been other reasons. And I think for that, we might imagine dairying, for example. We don't have any direct evidence of that, but dairy side products might have been useful and culinary interest in this period. But of course, we've got some of the direct evidence here. The other thing that these caprines are clearly providing conveniently is animal dung for fuel and possibly other activities as well. So here we may have, early management of caprines on a very small scale, but for very specific purposes, particularly secondary products, and especially shit, which is a marvelous thing, I think, if you need lots of fuel and don't have many trees around, like the Boncuklu community, or possibly even if you're starting out with early cultivation and want some fertilizer as well. So I think we shouldn't underestimate that as a factor. I think we've got further evidence from recent ancient DNA work on the caprines from Boncuklu and some of the other sites I've been talking about. This represents Boncuklu and Pınarbașı caprines pre-7500 BC. Each of the colours represent different haplogroups, genetic haplogroups. The shapes represent different haplotypes. You can see there was quite a diverse wild population in terms of haplotypes, probably hunted from Pınarbașı and possibly to a degree Boncuklu. But this haplogroup that they all belong to clearly became the predominant one amongst the early domesticates on the Konya plain. And then I think at Janasan 3 we see the genetic bottleneck that represents actual genetic domestication, interestingly, of a local haplotype. So I think this again strongly converges with our isotope evidence to suggest local domestication in this case. So whilst the plants, initially at least, are imported for farming purposes, it seems the animals are locally engaged in a process of management. The final big question I want to touch on is that of sedentism. I think studies of early sedentism have been theoretically underdeveloped and perhaps not sufficiently investigated, and so it's very interesting to have a little case study on the Konya plain to think a little bit more about this. Classic definitions of sedentism have typically given an either-or option. Sedentism, year-round residential occupation of sites over a number of years. That's the classic definition. So if people aren't year-round at settlements, then they're not sedentary. One guesses from that definition. But I like to think, and we're trialing out, I think, conceptually, a much more flexible sort of understanding of early sedentary behaviours with thinking much more in terms of a spectrum of behaviours and some significant variability in what it meant to be sedentary in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. So I've tried to visualise it a little bit this way with a seasonality axis and a longevity axis. And I think obviously communities could fall in different places along these various axes that we might consider sedentary, but might represent different sorts of behaviour where they have substantial multi-seasonal presence, sometimes over centuries or millennia, for example. So one might, I think validly suggest that a community that occupied a site 9 months a year continuously for 1,000 years might be considered as sedentary as a community that occupied a site year-round for 10 years, for example, but in a very different way. And that's perhaps something we can unpack a little bit by looking at these two neighbouring sites. So again, I would argue that theoretically we shouldn't think of sedentism as a homogeneous phenomenon especially in its early development. And I think we can explore that in Boncuklu and Pınarbașı as well. I've therefore suggested that there are several different axes we need to think about. We need to think about seasonality, certainly, but we also need to think about things like longevity of occupation, continuity, the degree of continuity of activity at sites, and intensity of activity at sites as well. And in a way, I've already started to give you some evidence that points to this in relation to these two sites. Both of these sites were occupied, it seems, pretty continuously from the evidence of the Bayesian analyses for either 1600 years at Boncuklu, now I've shown you the early dates, and 1700 years at Pınarbașı. These are pretty long-lived communities. Whether everyone always resided there year-round for the whole of this time, I think that's a different question, but they show very, very significant levels of commitment to place as part of this picture that we're talking about. Both equally so, in fact, Pınarbașı even more so, interestingly. What about the seasonality side of things? That's important too, of course. Well, here we start to see some interesting differences. At Boncuklu, I think there's very clear evidence for all seasons. Typically, of course, we look at seasonality of occupation by using reference to different seasonal harvestable resources. Here's the list for Boncuklu that give us the different seasons of occupation. The black bars are where we've got lots and lots of evidence that very clearly point to the specific months and phases, seasons of activity. And you can see the different black bars at Boncuklu pretty much add convincingly up to year-round occupation over much of the sequence from these indicators. I don't have time to go into them in great detail now, but you can ask me about them later if you'd like to. At Pınarbașı, we have slightly fewer indicators, and that may be part of the difference. But it does seem that while substantial occupation occurred for significant parts of the year, probably from January to June, for example, in the late summer, where a lot of locally available nuts and fruits were harvested from the surrounding hills. There are other seasons where there may have been some occupation, but the signature is much less clear, and perhaps people weren't there all the time. So I certainly argue there's some evidence for early sedentary behaviours at both these sites. Certainly they're both occupied over a long period, but there's a different set of practices, and there may have been some seasonal absences from Pınarbașı. That, in a way, throws up the question that we can explore through other evidence. The other indicator that Boncuklu might see more intensive sedentary residential behaviours is through the recent identification of the domestic house mouse, specifically in the Boncuklu houses. That's really interesting. I think we don't find it in the open areas. We don't find the house mouse in the open areas. They're in the houses at Boncuklu very specifically. So I think that shows a greater intensity of occupation, probably more stored foods available for these emergent domestic mice. We do have other ways of looking at this question of mobility and residential stability through the individual perspective as well as the total sites perspective. This is work recently published just in January in PNAS, led by Jessica Pearson, who looked at strontium and oxygen isotopes from individuals from Pınarbașı and Boncuklu. This narrow box here represents the strontium range, here strontium, for the alluvial and Lake Marl plain areas. And you can see that everyone from Boncuklu and Pınarbașı that we analysed clusters in this area. These isotopes were extracted from teeth samples. The teeth layers that were sampled form in childhood between 0 and 7. So these people all spent their childhood somewhere within the Konya Basin area. Oxygen, though, gives us a north-south gradient, and that's where things start to become interesting, I think. You can see, actually, most of the Boncuklu individuals, male and female, cluster in the centre, which is where they should be, as Boncuklu is up here more or less in the middle of the plain. So these people all spent their childhoods in the area around Boncuklu, and that, so that is a nice indicator, I think, a different sort of indicator at an individual level of a significant degree of sedentary behaviours. However, you will note, and we'll revisit these friends, these individuals a bit later on in their lecture, but there is an adult female who either spent significant amount of time in the southern area of the plain, perhaps through seasonal visits there from Boncuklu, or actually grew up in the southern area of the plain and after the age of 7 came to Boncuklu, potentially, perhaps quite a few years after. There's another individual here. He's very interesting, adult male. He has a signature further to the north in the plain than Boncuklu. And this is really interesting because this is the signature of the 3 individuals we were able to analyse from contemporary Pınarbașı. He has a Pınarbașı signature, in effect. So perhaps he actually came to Boncuklu in adulthood from Pınarbașı, or he spent some of his childhood operating in the same area as the Pınarbașı community, which is an interesting possibility, a seasonal absence from Boncuklu in his childhood. The weird thing about these Pınarbașı individuals is that they're in the wrong place on this graph for the location of the site. If you remember back to the initial map I showed you, Pınarbașı is located here, southeast of Boncuklu. So actually these people are showing quite a northerly signature for people who obviously end up buried and spent some time at Pınarbașı. So probably that suggests seasonal mobility in those seasons in the seasonality graph, particularly the autumn, I think, of seasonal absence from Pınarbașı in this more northerly area of the plain. So I think we're starting to unpack mobility patterns for these communities and the different way in which sedentary behaviour is expressed. Further supporting this is the way our single epipaleolithic individual actually is in the right location for Pınarbașı. He was buried at Pınarbașı. He spent his childhood in the Pınarbașı area, quite close to Pınarbașı, which is very interesting when you think that, generally we conceive of epipaleolithic communities as more mobile. But I don't have so much the time to talk about that in this lecture, but will in the seminar I'm doing tomorrow. So that allows us, I think, for you to understand some of the answers we're giving to these bigger questions that are suggested. And just like the adoption of cultivation, clearly early sedentary practices are quite diverse in the Konya plain between different communities. I now want to focus a bit more on Boncuklu to start to unpack the role of households and individuals in these developments. First of all, but this also relates to this question of sedentism, I want to talk about the question of continuity of occupation at the site. One of the striking things about Boncuklu is the degree of repetitive behaviours on the site, whether that's a use of space, types of activity, ritual practices, as you'll see. And this is very evident in the construction of domestic structures. Actually, unlike later Çatalhöyük, domestic residential structures at Boncuklu are not packed tightly together across the site. They're widely dispersed. There are big open spaces, which are important social arenas at the site, as I'll explain in a moment or two. People, however, even though they had lots of space to build in, they chose to continually rebuild their houses in the same location. These photographs show you a picture of 4 out of 6 houses in one area of excavation that were continually rebuilt on the same location. We can attest direct continuity as well, because actually sometimes they reuse features in earlier buildings, in later buildings, reconstructing the hearth in the same location, just building the rim up a bit higher when they rebuild the new house in that location. This is a deliberate choice, I think, because they could have moved the house elsewhere into the open spaces. And actually, it was a deliberate choice that was quite demanding of their architectural engineering, because unlike the Çatalhöyük houses, where the upper parts are knocked down, a platform is created, the new house is built on the walls of the old house, these houses are continually, they're demolished and filled in, but then they're continually redug into each other. So it's like a series of Russian dolls, however, that move around slightly, which meant, I think, sometimes the architecture was not the most stable. So people clearly wanted to live over the earlier houses that probably their ancestors had lived in. I see this as a symbolic statement of house continuity, if you like, a material statement of the continuing biological and economic success of the household, if you like, a very deliberate statement. There was another reason, too, that people wanted, I think, to live over the ancestral house. And that's because that's where the ancestral dead were buried. The term ancestor is bandied around in archaeology, particularly in Neolithic archaeology in Southwest Asia. How ancestral were these ancestors buried under the earlier houses over which people lived? Well, according to our ancient DNA studies, the answer is pretty ancestral, really. There are clear indications of close genealogical links, biological links between the individuals buried in these sequence of houses. This is a sequence of 2 houses here. This is building 12, this is building 14. And the ancient DNA clearly shows us matched pairs of people with first-degree biological relationships. This is a brother buried late in the life of building 12, and this is his sister buried very early in the life of building 14. A bit later in the life of building 14, a mother was buried and then her son. So there's very, very tight genealogical relationships in the people buried in these houses. These are tight little households, I think, with close relationships that include a genealogical, biological component in the construction of association with these houses. Whether these people lived in these houses, of course, all the time, that's a more difficult question to answer, but clearly they were connected to them. Not everyone, of course, who was buried in these houses was necessarily connected, very interestingly. So they're probably quite complex kinship arrangements, I think, despite these direct biological relationships. For example, this is the burial of the adult female, who's the sister of the guy buried in building 12. She had a neonate, a perinatal child buried with her. Of course, when we first discovered this, the immediate thought was, well, is this a mother who died in childbirth buried with her stillborn or very early dying child? Interestingly, we know from the ancient DNA that this child, it's obviously difficult to sex such individuals, but this child genetically was female, and she has no genetic relationship with the adult female buried in the same grave, or obviously with these other pairs either. So there are people, even very young, being brought into these houses as part of the construction of ancestry and continuity as part of these households, which I think suggests, despite the apparent simplicity of some of these relationships, quite complex household and kin relationships, including possibly adoption even at death. I've mentioned already the importance of symbolic statements of continuity in the reconstruction of the house, and I think there's the Boncuklu houses are full of evidence of ritual and symbolism, some of which point to a close identity, I think, between these tight-knit households with their distinctive kin arrangements and the houses themselves. And this is why my title refers to the animate house. I think the household, whether it lived in the house all the time or not, identified closely with the house and expressed that identity in material ways. And in many ways, I think the house was thought of probably as an animate entity that was part of the household. And I think we can see this in the ritual treatment of the house, particularly at the death of the house. We've talked about the burial of people in the house. Of course, houses themselves became buried under later houses. And when the houses died, they were dismantled, disarticulated, like some but not all human bodies, as you'll find out in a moment. And then deposits were placed in the post holes from which the skeleton of the building were removed. So this is a particularly nice example in the final phase of building 21, this neat little bear figurine, or perhaps human bear hybrid figure, was placed in the post hole with an obsidian tool. And many of the post holes have little objects in them. The predecessor post to this one saw the deposit of burnt material, a little figurine fragment in there, for example. Obsidian tools, bone tools are deposited. There's an obsidian microlith next to a caprine bone point. One of the other things the caprines are important for was provisioning a lot of the bone points on the site. And there are groundstone tools in these post holes as well. It must have been placed in after the post was taken out. So it's a ritualization, house closure set of activities. And the other thing that strikes me about a lot of these objects is that just like the posts that would have gone in the post holes, the wood for the post wasn't available. Oak and juniper the favoured building materials were not available in the immediate surrounds of the site. They came from the hills. And of course, that's where bears and cat brines and obsidian and groundstone all came from as well. So there's a sort of replacement of the posts with material that's redolent of the places that the wood came from, a sort of giving back to the house as well. So just to summarise where we've got to so far, I think people in spatially and chronologically sequential houses are closely related through a form of genealogical ancestry and kinship in house burial groups. People are closely associated with ancestors and ancestral houses. House and individual histories create continuity in this manner, underpinning what we understand to be early sedentism. There's other very clear indications of the intensity and continuity expressed in the materiality of these buildings. The floors of the buildings are replastered many, many times. And actually there's an interesting choice of plaster to use. The buildings are regularly divided. Almost all the buildings we've excavated are divided into a larger southeastern area and a northwestern sunken area. The hearth is in this northwestern area, so we should see it as the kitchen area. These houses are kept pretty clean, but it's in this area we see lots of tiny fragmented burnt animal bone related to probably marrow extraction in the kitchen area. But different plasters are chosen for the kitchen area and the main living area, let's call it, of the structure. The finer, whiter plasters are used for this area, and the whole of the area is plastered in one go. In a moment, I'll explain. I think this was probably an annual event. We have evidence for that. So it was a very regular and repetitive practice, but the household constructed the house throughout its occupation and constructed a symbolic contrast between the clean area and the dirty area of the house, and its choice of materials and the way they were applied, as we understand from the micromorphological thin section studies. And as I said, these whiter plaster floors were kept very clean. It's in this area of the house that the ritual and symbolic activity that I've talked about so far was practiced, particularly the burial of individuals, but also the deposit of some of those objects we've talked about when the house was dismantled, but also the building of animal parts, particularly head parts, into the walls and floors of these buildings. So there's a strong differentiation between the clean and the dirty area of these houses, the clean area, the kitchen area, the clean area, the kitchen area, as you can see in this 3D model. These are some of the grave pits for this building, building 21. You can see in the cleaner area of the house. So there's a strong symbolic set of cues for the use of the house by the inhabitants who operated in the kitchen area, what was done there, what happened in the clean area, for example. And of course, one of the things about these cues is that it meant that anyone who lived in a Boncuklu house and went to another Boncuklu house knew just how to behave because of the materiality of the reference points in these houses. I think that's one of the things that made it easier for these communities to co-locate and live together over obviously very, very long periods of time, which is a key phenomenon of these early sedentary practices. Having said that there's a lot of uniformity, I think one of the other interesting things is there's a lot of individuality at the same time within these houses, particularly in the specifics of the deployment of ritual and symbolism. I've mentioned the business of building animal parts into the walls and floors of the houses, particularly the walls. Again, another antecedent practice to that we see at slightly later Çatalhöyük, just a few kilometers away and, a few centuries later. Typically, while cattle skull parts are deployed, the famous bicrania, but also while boar jaws are built into niches into walls. Quite often the cattle skulls are modified in various ways. This is a very neat one. It's a double bicranium built actually at the junction between the clean and dirty area in building 4 here. They chopped off the right-hand side, the right horn of this bicranium and the left at this, so they could make this enormous double wild bull, and they are wild bull skulls, bicranium. No other building has such double bicrania, for example. In this case, in building 26. This wild male boar jaw is located in this niche, unlike most of the other head parts of animals, not facing into the house, but facing out of the house. This is the outside of the house here. This is the inside. So there's a idiosyncrasy to the deployment of these materials that I think signals a distinctive household identity through this ritual and symbolic practice. I've mentioned the regular replastering of the clean area of these buildings. We can get a sense of how frequent this was. In the recent past, they stopped building mud brick houses in the village next to Boncuklu probably about 40 years ago. But still in some areas of the Konya Plain there are mud brick houses, and people we talk to reference the annual replastering of the houses. So there's an ethno-historic reference point here. But we've actually got direct C14 evidence, I think, that would point to an annual replastering. This is a Bayesian analysis of a whole sequence of in situ dates from in situ samples from the sequence of 6 buildings in Area K that I've introduced you to already. If we count the main floors in the clean areas in these 6 buildings, we end up with 75 floors for a sequence that was running between 60 and 120 years, according to the Bayesian analysis. So I think that fits well, probably, with an annual replastering, possibly missing the occasional year. This provides us then very neatly at Boncuklu with what I like to call as floor clocks. We've got a real sense of the temporality of the occupation of these buildings. Often that's something we struggle with in archaeology, I think, to understand how buildings are, how long they're occupied for. And that's really important for understanding the experience of use, but some of the other evidence that we find in the frequency of ritual practice, for example. This shows you the number of painted floors over the number of floors straight years in these buildings. You can see that floor painting and wall painting in the Boncuklu buildings was a sporadic, probably a special event once every few years, and it was the same with the insertion of animal head parts as well. So it gives us a sense of the infrequency and probably highly charged moments in the history of these houses. And in a moment, you'll see the value of floor clocks as we reconstruct the intertwined history of houses and individuals in a moment or two. One of the things I haven't quite touched on, though, and this is a slight diversion for a second, is how this sedentism was constructed in, and this degree of continuity, intensity of occupation was constructed in terms of resource exploitation. It's often suggested that, the large-scale harvesting of cereal crops and storage of those crops underpinned early sedentism. Well, I can tell you at Boncuklu that doesn't work. One of the things you may have noticed already is there are no storage bins or storage pits in the Boncuklu houses. They probably had small baskets in which they stored a modest amount of material. What underpins the sedentary behaviours at Boncuklu is the wide range, it's a classic broad spectrum type situation as described by Binford and Flannery. There's a wide range, especially of aquatic resources from the surrounding wetlands that are exploited alongside the cultivation and the hunting of larger wild animals like aurochs. We've got large numbers of water birds, that obviously help to point to the aquatic local environment, very large amounts of fish from a whole range of different types of watery habitats, and huge amounts of frog on the site, lots of marsh frog. 90% of the microfauna at the site are marsh frog. Did they just hop onto the site? No, people ate them. We've got butchery marks on them. We also are very fortunate. One of my favourite bits of the site, you may say that's my problem, is the human toilet areas that we have. These are Neolithic coprolites that you're seeing here, and they're stuffed full of fish bone and frog bone as well. They ate a lot of these species. So it's not the early cultivation that's, or even intensive gathering of wild plants that's underpinning sedentary behaviour here, and storage isn't necessary on the same scale as slightly later Neolithic sites there, but it's actually the range of animals that are being exploited along with nut resources from the surrounding hills. So I think that's an interesting aside and one of the bigger questions, but I want to come back to the house histories and the individual histories here. We've mentioned the burials under the floors. They're usually articulated inhumations with their with their skulls present. One of the interesting things that people have recognized in another number of Neolithic sites is there don't seem to be enough burials, people have argued. But they've done that, of course, without knowing the length of occupation of the houses. We've got a better sense of that here. And sometimes I think we do have enough burials. In the building 12 and 14 sequence, which lasted probably about 50 years, we've got 8 or 9 individuals, which seems plausible a number for people who might have lived in or used the house. But in other situations, we do, I think, lack people. In this probable 75-plus year occupation of the sequence of 6 buildings in Area K, we only have, well, we have 2 complete inhumations and then some fragmentary bones in the fills of those inhumations from perinatal children. This seems, so 1 adult and 3 perinatal individuals, in effect. This doesn't seem to represent the house-occupying population over 75 years for that sequence. So there do seem to be some missing dead at Boncuklu as far as looking at the houses goes. At Boncuklu, though, we know where they are. They're in the open spaces between the houses, where we have a series of depositions of human remains, some fully articulated inhumations, like some under the houses, but some instances, including some of the sorts of grave goods, the shell bead necklaces, as we see in some of the house burials as well. But actually what we don't find under the houses, and we do have in the open areas, is disarticulated human remains, and especially quite a few human skulls. It seems that some people's remains were subject to different mortuary practices. Their bodies were disarticulated and their skulls retrieved and circulated for a long time and deposited in these open spaces in special pits, or sometimes just in the midden. So I think we start to see, just like the houses, the open spaces as ritual arenas, as well as places where households interacted for task activities and the like, of which we've got plenty of evidence. So it's interesting that some people who presumably lived in the houses, and I'll show you evidence of that in a moment, they were also then buried in the open spaces rather than under the houses, perhaps reflecting the presence of different sorts of social groups and arrangements at the site, of which more in a moment. Other interesting things happened in these open spaces, including, I mentioned, the deposition in situ, as far as we understand it from the micromorphology, of lots of coprolites. These are also toilet areas. And interestingly, some of the burials in these open spaces like this late adolescent male are actually buried in these ongoing human toilet areas. What does that say about these individuals? Well, you might jump to certain conclusions, but I think we have to be careful. Perhaps these are important spaces. They're clearly spaces in the center of the settlement of key sociality. We have thousands of coprolites deposited in the very public toilet at the center of the site. There are some, the people buried in the open spaces whose skulls are buried or who are fully articulated, they seem to represent the same cross-section of the population, adult men and women and children. But there are some other interesting differences apart from the fact that some of them are disarticulated and their skulls circulate and occasionally are painted. It's interesting that there are a lot more grave goods, a lot more of the burials, I should say, or mortuary depositions in the external areas have grave goods than under the houses, for example. So there are things saying that maybe because it was a much more public context for the deposition of human remains in these open spaces, there was a more ostentatious deposition of material with the dead. That's an interesting possibility. So who were these people buried in the open spaces? Presumably they lived in the houses. So I'll skip ahead actually. Some of these people here are some of those in the open space. They're as local as the people buried under the houses, for example. They're not, or most of them are not coming from other places, but more of that in a moment. So they're local individuals, presumably having lived in some of these houses that their kin are buried under. But interestingly, the people whose skulls at least circulate, are removed and circulate and are deposited in open spaces, they show different nitrogen and carbon isotope ratios from the people buried under the houses. These are all carbon and nitrogen isotopes of the different species of animals at Boncuklu. The squares are the skulls deposited in the open spaces. The diamonds are the articulated humans in the houses. And you can see clearly there's a difference in diet. This sort of evidence of diet relates to the preceding 10 years of life of the individuals that we're talking about. So it's not like a coprolite perspective on diet. So it means that these people shared food together in a way that was different from the way that people were buried in the houses. So this, I would argue, shows evidence of a discrete, living corporate group that drew its members from the houses. It cross-cut the relationships of ancestry demonstrated through the houses at a different level of social organisation and separated off different social entities within the community. Perhaps a more complex arrangement than what one might imagine for these early village societies. The foods that these people ate are down here on the diagram, and these are essentially aquatic resources: fish, the triangles, fish, water birds, aquatic birds, and amphibians like tortoises, probably lots of the frogs as well. So it's a very distinctive difference in diet. It's not that this group didn't eat any aurochs or boar, for example. It's just that they ate less aurochs and boar relative to the people buried under the houses. So lifetime practices are reflected in these distinctions in mortuary practices, in quite complex social arrangements binding people together in different ways. Whilst most of the people whose remains end up in the external areas spent their childhood locally, it's interesting that the two people I've mentioned who possibly spent seasons away from Boncuklu in their childhood, or maybe even came from other places, Pınarbașı or a settlement or community on the south of the plain, these, certainly the adult male, we've seen him already, he was buried in the external area. And the woman from the south, let's call her, she was probably an external burial as well, but she was close to the surface, so it's more difficult to be sure in her case. But there's a possibility that at least a small proportion of those who were subject to non-house burial did have a different individual life history, if you like. And that brings me on to the final thing that I want to talk about, because I think I'm just at my 45 minutes, which is getting down to life histories. And you know, we've got very rich data sets here, and I think we can start to do some quite amazing things when we integrate them all. And I want to illustrate this by just looking at the house histories and the life stories of individuals buried in this sequence of buildings, Building 12 and Building 14, where I think we can start to understand an intertwined set of house and individual histories. And I summarise that in this table. Obviously, I'm not going to go through it all in great detail here, but it's a useful reference point to show how, you know, rich our information is about these houses and their people and when they were buried. The floor clocks give us a sense of the passage of time here. These are all burials represented by each row on this diagram, and you can see the point in the sequence in the lives of the houses at which people were buried. And we know the age approximately of these individuals. So we can, for example, just quickly hone in on the mother of the son that was buried in Building 14. She was buried in probably the 20th year or just over the 20th year of the use of Building 14. She was over 50 when she was buried. So interestingly, that immediately tells us actually she existed probably over the whole lifetime of the sequence of two buildings that we're talking about. And of course, she must have known some of the people that were buried a few years earlier than her, either in Building 12 and Building 14. Even though they're not genetically related, the brother and sister, to the mother and son, this mother must have known them. We can also, for example, intriguingly say that she died probably just a couple of years before her son. So we can start to build up those sorts of stories about these people. And we can see other things as well. We have osteobiographies in this information. And there's some really interesting common traits in the pathology of the individuals here. Most of them show heavy wear on the teeth, probably a diet from grinding foods with volcanic rocks, probably meat and plant foods, I think. They almost all show very significant wear on their skeletons on their bodies, and that's where a lot of the osteoarthritis comes from. They clearly all carried heavy loads as adults, with a lot of pressure on their spines. Many of them showing squatting facets as well. They tended to squat in the same way. And actually, a lot of them show evidence of infections too, mostly healed infections that are got over. So their bodies underwent a lot of wear and tear over quite long lives, it would appear, but quite similar wear and tear, intriguingly. Of course, we can also disentangle diets as well. The interesting thing is that the adult women in this set of burial group share quite similar diets, with probably quite a lot of aquatic sources, but also wild boar in the diets, whereas the two adult males buried in this sequence show evidence of consuming more meat, probably more wild cattle meat in particular. So while diet did unify members of these households to a degree, it also apparently separated men and women a little bit in this situation, a somewhat gendered identity, for example. And then we can look at things like grave goods. There's another trait that's continued throughout this sequence of houses, and that is that actually none of the adults have grave goods. And if you think back to the diagrams I've showed you already, that's really interesting, because obviously we know that the people buried outside in external areas have a lot more grave goods, but actually that means that, remember, there are about 18% of the adult burials in houses have grave goods. So actually other sequences of houses where they have burials have more grave goods. This is a particular trait of this household. I think this is very much reflective of what we see in the ritual and symbolism in the houses too, which is of, a set of household identities developing through repeated individual practices and shared behaviours that vary from one house to another, and can be interestingly seen in the house stories of these individuals. All of these individuals, it appears, in terms of where they spent their childhood, strontium and oxygen, were born and brought up in the locality of Boncuklu. Even the son, let's call him, buried late in the life of building 14. But here we get, I think, an additional insight through isotopes into post-childhood mobility. This person, this male, is a very interesting person, because I think he has very distinctive carbon and nitrogen isotopes, which obviously relates to the animals and plants he's eating, that are very different for everyone else at Boncuklu. So he's a local individual in terms of his strontium and oxygen, but in the 10 years preceding his death, he ate rather different sorts of animals, probably in particular. Animals that ate C4 plants, a very distinctive group of plants that aren't that common on the plain and would have been found in steppe areas. This suggests that either he went away from the settlement for a few years and came back to be eventually to die and be buried in the same house as his mother, or he was seasonally absent from the site over the 10 years preceding his death for lengthy periods of time. So I think we can see the way in which mobility fits within this constructed, continuous set of sedentary practices from an individual perspective now as well. And finally, one really neat little thing that we know about his life history. He's one of the earliest cases we can directly attest in the archaeological record of an individual with hepatitis B, sexually transmitted disease, of course, and it's intriguing to think he was a well-travelled individual, that his bones indicate extreme shin flattening, as well as his carbon and nitrogen isotopes. So here we get a hint of the way in which diseases and other things probably sped through communities, ideas and innovations like plant cultivation, to take me back to the beginning of the talk. So I think we can start to unpack at an individual and household level some of the phenomena that constructed sedentary and cultivating behaviours in these small-scale communities, and see the importance of corporate behaviours and different sorts of social, quite complex social arrangements that gave cohesion to these communities and allowed them to persist for millennia, whether or not they were practicing cultivation or not. I think I'm out of time, so that's a good time to stop. Thank you very much.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.